this is Rick Kasalich from exercisesforinjuries.com. Today I have another interview for you, and it is with Sarah, Dr. Sarah. I'll call her Dr. Sarah. So Sarah, I'll get you to introduce yourself to the viewers, listeners, and readers, and then we'll get into the interview.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Rick. I appreciate it.
Okay, so Sarah, if you can let people know a little bit about you.
Sure. I am a sports medicine physical therapist that has, as of late, been focusing on women's health, and I absolutely love it. Becoming a mom myself has really made me open my eyes to what women need postpartum to repair their pelvic floors and get their abs back. And so this has just been my passion for the last few years, is figuring out the best way I can help women.
Awesome. And you probably see this often after pregnancy. You know, it could be someone that's had a C-section, even if they had with a C-section, which is, it's a traumatic thing to the body, and the body ends up getting drastically affected. And my philosophy always is, you know, just because there is no pain doesn't mean things are kind of functioning properly. And a C-section is an example of that. But even if you don't have a C-section, you kind of have like a natural birth. I mean, a lot of things can go out, you know, out of whack from it. And once again, it might be painful afterwards. The pain might go away, but the function might not predispose, like slowing you down from other things or increasing your risk to that. Maybe you can kind of expand on that a little bit more when it comes to, you know, health issues that females need to think about after pregnancy.
Well, I think the biggest thing too is what you're saying is it takes away time from your child. I mean, all moms want to be able to go and play with their kids. They want to be able to jump on a trampoline. They want to be able to crawl around on the floor, and they don't want things hurting. So some of the biggest complaints and biggest issues I see are, you know, abdominal separation, which is more like a mommy tummy, where you're like, I just don't have my abs back. I feel like they just won't contract. They don't support me. I've got this belly. I look like I'm 3 months pregnant. What can I do about that? So that's a really common thing I see. Pelvic floor, either pain or leaking. You know, we call it sneeze pee, which what's really like the advertising angle of that. Don't actually treat it. Just buy some pads. So, but it's become this, you know, kind of common thing with moms. It's like, oh yeah, I have that. But that's so much. It's so much more fixable now than it used to be. So, the old recommendations of doing Kegels, just tightening your pelvic floor, is no longer the standard recommendation. And I think there's just a lot of healthcare providers that aren't telling their patients that yet. So basically getting to these moms and letting them know that you don't have to suffer from leaks if you jump on a trampoline with your kid or want to go for a run or cough, or, you know, and getting your abs back. So those are probably two of the primary complaints I see postpartum.
Awesome. And then the topic that we were going to kind of focus in on is diastasis, and maybe you can kind of explain what that is. Maybe you can explain what that is, and then we'll kind of go from there.
I am amazed at the amount of women who don't even know it exists, don't know what it is, don't know how to check for it, don't know they have it. So from here on out, diastasis, let's call it an abdominal separation. Okay, so basically it's where your abs kind of start to thin or separate in the middle. They're not going to come apart, okay? So it's not, you know, we're not going to freak out here. But basically when you're pregnant and you stretch rapidly, you have that big growing belly baby, those abs get pulled on in the middle. And then what can happen is they cannot come back postpartum like they should. So one of the biggest questions that I've been asking in my profession is, why do some women bounce back and other women don't? So instead of trying to make women feel better, oh, it's okay, you can just look 3 months pregnant the rest of your life, I'm asking, what can we do about this? And why is this woman over here bounce back who gained the same weight, got the same size, same exercise routine, and this woman over here didn't? So that's kind of I think the health aspect of that diastasis.
Okay. And then you kind of touched on, but like, how would, you know, we're not asking for someone to diagnose themselves, but what would be kind of like symptoms or things that they would feel and see that might be signs that they have this?
Well, you might not actually feel anything, Okay, so one of, I think, the later symptoms of diastasis or abdominal separation is when you're constantly bending over a crib or picking up a heavy car seat. I mean, kids, the products they make for kids nowadays are so heavy.
Yeah.
And so you might get back pain,
Hmm.
right? So this might be where, so basically when your abs start to pull apart in the front, it decreases your body's ability to handle a load through your spine. So just not to be too complicated on that, but think about your trunk, your torso, as this container. And it's this muscle wall that helps protect your spine. So when your abs don't come back in the middle and the front like they should, they affect the back. So one of the common complaints I see is maybe even just a nagging back pain or from bending over so much. So that's telling me it's not working. Maybe your belly pooches out. And it didn't do that prior to kids, and no matter how much ab work you do, you can't seem to get it back. So those are probably two of the most common signs that there could be a diastasis at play.
Okay, and oftentimes what people will do is, either they'll know that their abdominal is weak or abdominal area is weak, and then they want to start exercising. You kind of jump to either what you did in college or in high school, or you just kind of grab the next magazine or something off the internet. Like, what would be some do's and don'ts when it comes to exercising with this
Yeah, what can
abdominal
make it better
separation?
and what can make it worse?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've seen women with just a small diastasis postpartum and they make it so much worse because they do the wrong exercises. So basically, if you want to check yourself for diastasis to even know if you have it, this should direct your exercise postpartum. But you lie on your back and you pick up your head and you can feel the middle separation of your abdominal wall. And I have a great video on my website and on YouTube for checking your own diastasis that walks you through it step by step. So you can find that resource there. But once you've checked yourself for your diastasis and you're like, Sarah, I've got a 3-finger gap or 4-finger or 2-finger, whatever it is, you need to take special measures before you jump back into your regular exercise routine. So what I would avoid is anything loading the front of your body. So basically front planks, sit-ups, even push-ups. Push-ups are just a front plank with arm motion, so don't let them fool you. V-sits, hundreds in Pilates, roll-ups, anything like that where you're loading the front. Think coming forward or putting pressure on the front is a big no-no for pulling apart on that abdominal separation.
Okay. And then, can this abdominal separation be, one of the causes that women have after pregnancy when it relates to back pain?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's definitely one of the main things I see is that complaint of chronic back pain or back pain that's nagging or just won't go away. And long term, I mean, I see some women 20 years postpartum still have an abdominal separation, and they came to see me for back pain then, and they never knew they had it in the first place, and we get that fixed, and then their back pain clears up.
Okay. And so we've kind of talked about the abdominal area, but kind of as we know, the six pack, rectus abdominis isn't the only abdominal area, or it's not the only area that provides support in the abdominal area. So now we're going to kind of talk about like the pelvic floor. So how does the pelvic floor, or I kind of call it like the bottom part of the canister. If you look at your abdominal area, it ends up being a canister. One part of the wall ends up being six pack or rectus abdominis, and then the bottom part of that cylinder ends up being pelvic floor. But maybe you can kind of talk about about pelvic floor, why it's the big deal, and what would be some symptoms that would be signs that, okay, maybe my pelvic floor isn't working right.
Oh, absolutely. And before we jump to pelvic floor really quick, just that what you mentioned, that whole body picture for that diastasis and that looking at that whole core and whole canister, healing that diastasis has more to do with how your diaphragm functions on the top, how you shift your weight on your feet, how your pelvis connects and comes together, what's firing. So how your whole body works, which is why simply drawing in your belly button or doing more ab work doesn't fix a diastasis. So I just wanted to touch on that really quick because I don't want women rushing out thinking, all right, I got to do ab work now. What do I do? So it's more of a how your body is loading itself. and how it's controlling different parts. So moving on to pelvic floor. So pelvic floor is definitely the bottom of the canister, but I actually consider the pelvic floor a follower, not a leader when it comes to the body. So basically, if you have pelvic floor issues, so I would think pain during sex, pain during inserting a tampon, maybe not even pain, but basically, let's say you feel like you can't tighten your pelvic floor as well as you could have post-baby, as you could pre-baby, which would affect your quality of your sex life. Leaking when you sneeze, leaking when you cough, leaking when you jump, leaking when you just have bronchitis. So those are some of the pelvic floor symptoms that are common.
Okay. And I mean, is it pretty much just like one disorder when it comes to pelvic floor?
So the interesting thing is, and I think people will find this very fascinating, because I think most women have heard of Kegels, the tightening your pelvic floor, like, oh, do your Kegels, do your Kegels. Well, it turns out that Kegels only help about a quarter, 25% of women, because a big majority of women actually have pelvic floors that are too tight.
Oh.
So I know that sounds really crazy, but when we look at treatment and we look at the whole body, we have to ask ourselves, why is the pelvic floor too tight? Why does a tight pelvic floor cause leaks? So basically, if you were to take your arm and you were to hold it tight all the time,
Yeah.
you would actually lose bicep muscle, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you can lengthen it all the way and then contract it, you build this great muscle. So the same thing is true for the pelvic floor. If women can't open and lengthen their pelvic floors, then they can't fully contract them. So you end up with this tight pelvic floor, but it doesn't function properly. So this is important. And so we have to look at what makes the pelvic floor tight. Okay, what gives it this dysfunction? And that's where I find the pelvic floor is a follower. So the pelvic floor will make up for the rest of the muscles in the canister that are weak. So like you mentioned, that canister, that great top of that pelvis that surrounds the entire core, your pelvic floor is sitting on the bottom. And if your abs aren't contracting correctly around the top, okay, then we come back to some of that abdominal separation we just talked about. Mm-hmm. If your diaphragm isn't putting great dynamic pressure down on the pelvic floor and that abdominal canister, if your hips aren't working properly, if your glutes, you talk about glutes a lot, having great glutes. So if your glutes don't lengthen and open, if your adductors, inner thighs don't work properly, your pelvic floor is going to be like, well, somebody has to hold the pelvis together.
Yeah.
It's going to tighten up. So basically looking at the pelvic floor to treat a pelvic floor issue only works in about a quarter of women. The rest of them actually need to look at the entire body and what the missing link is that's making the pelvic floor compensate.